Just going to give a few moments for people to come into the room. Welcome, everybody. Well, I'm going to get started with some introductions to One Health. This is our second One Health seminar of the semester. I hope that many of you have been to One Health seminars in the past. For those that have not, just a little bit about what One Health is. While One Health has been described by others as relating it primarily to whether it's veterinary health or whether it's human health, or environmental health in relationship to those medical kinds of concerns. One Health at Del Val is much broader than that. I think probably to put it in the simplest forms, there's only one planet. We're all on this planet together. And whether you're part of the human society or whether you're a plant or an animal or part of the environment, we're all inextricably linked to each other. And it would probably, or it will actually be a benefit to everyone's career and to their future if we pay attention to the fact that there's one future and it's the same future for all of us. And that we in turn need to learn from each other and to address the problems that are faced locally, regionally, internationally, uh, through the eyes of multiple viewers. That I may have expertise in one area, but things will go much better if I work with others. And you know, you probably in your classes have had to do team projects, and sometimes those are very difficult, but you always learn from interacting with others. So, One Health is this transdisciplinary systems approach, looking at the broader system and how we can make good choices for the future. At Del Val, we usually approach this from three different points of view. One is education and coursework itself, whether it's in Del Val Experience 2, or whether it's in particular courses that recognize these linkages between people, the environment, and other living organisms. Or it could be through transdisciplinary research. I would say that we've got a ways to go with that yet at Del Val, but it certainly is something that we're encouraging. And then finally, outreach, and that's what tonight is all about. The 6 seminars that we provide not only to the campus, but to a broader community each semester are intended to provide an opportunity to listen to other people's point of view, to learn about topics that maybe we've never had any exposure to before, and to appreciate other disciplines and other points of view, and to maybe incorporate that into our lives. And I think it makes us better people. It makes us better global citizens, I hope. So tonight we are very fortunate to have 2 of our own with us. We've got Doctors Jess McCall and Brian Lutz with us tonight, and I'm going to do a great job of reading right off the flyer their introduction. So Dr. Brian Lutz is a professor of English and the current chair of the department. In 2021, he was named Distinguished Faculty Member of the Year. His scholarly focuses revolve around critical trends in contemporary literature with a special concentration on place and poetry. In 2003, he was named Poet Laureate of Bucks County. Dr. Lutz has published widely in various local, national, and international journals. Dr. Jessica McCall is a professor of English and coordinator of interdisciplinary studies at Del Val. Her research focuses on the ways narratives of gender directly impact lived experience, the stories we want to tell, and the stories that we're willing to hear. I welcome them to One Health, and I'm sure you all enjoy this. And if you have questions, please put them into the Q&A at the bottom of the screen, and we will get to them later in the event. Thank you so much.
Okay, hi everybody. I'm not 100% sure how well this is sharing, because on my end it looks a little strange, but I'm just going to trust that it's going well, and then
it looks fine, Brian.
Okay, thank you. Dr. McCall and I today are going to talk a little bit about the idea of One Health Communications, which is a grant that we were awarded from the National Endowment of the Humanities as a way to talk about the function of the humanities, and in particular communication in the broader One Health umbrella. The means by which we're going to do this is to spend a moment kind of giving some conversation about how communication works so far as we can tell, and then show an example of what we think might be one way in which we can communicate complex ideas, and then open it up to all of you to ask us some questions and wrestle with some of these ideas together, hopefully, because it is, after all, a presentation on communication. Jess, did you want to add anything to start?
Nope, I'm ready to jump in.
Okay. So our plan is to talk about communication as a collective communicative disease. Let's spend a moment kind of talking about this. I'm going to give you one way to think about how we might tell the story of a disease, any disease, but it's going to fit under what we call the narrative paradigm. So imagine this. There's a fruit bat. Let's call her Meg. She's flapping around the Maldives or Australia or Thailand, pick a place, minding her own business, hungry for a mango or a banana. Meg doesn't know it, but she's hosting a disease that co-evolved with her over the millions of years of her, well, not her individually, but over the millions of years of evolution. She's healthy. She's happy. She lives with a few 100,000 of her closest friends. And then one day when she's out flying and eating, she meets a man with a net. This is a narrative approach to storytelling, and we'll kind of get into some of the rest of that in a moment. There's Meg. Unnecessary animation.
Meg's a happy bat. So the beauty of narrative is it becomes a vehicle to help us understand other ideas, right? So if we think of, and I'm pulling in part from my experiences teaching the disease outbreak class with Dr. Jennifer Shelley, and she does the epidemiology, which is my caveat in case I mess up any of the science here. But in that particular class, we are trying to address exactly what we're talking about here, how we approach both the necessary information that you need to memorize and learn, and how to communicate that in a useful way. So working with Meg the bat, we understand that these diseases start in animals, and it's not until they mutate, right? At first, they can't infect us and we're fine. But the moment they mutate and they can jump, which is what happened with COVID, which is what happened with a number of diseases, then we don't have any immune response oftentimes. Not always the case, but sometimes. And so we have here a good metaphoric vehicle to understand misinformation, i.e., when you have a story, it can be harmless, right? The fact that the story isn't true doesn't necessarily matter until it starts to spread. And as that story spreads, it mutates. And we see this online especially. And as it mutates and spreads, then you also have the issue of it starts to replace what we think of as true. It starts to replace what we think of as evidence. And once that takes root, once you're infected, rational conversation is not going to be what changes your mind. We love to imagine that we are controlled by logic, but of course we are not. And so one of the things we will explore is how that works out and why that is so.
So we're going to talk a little bit about how communication functions and works, and a little bit about maybe what's surprising about how it works. And we do want to spend some time talking about what makes good communication, but we have to recognize that communication has its limits, and we can't say, for example, to a population of people who resist vaccines or don't believe in global warming or any number of other things, that if you could just communicate the idea in a slightly different way, it would fix everything. Good communication doesn't guarantee that. So I'm going to kind of go through some of what it's not first. It's not a formula exactly. There are formulas we can follow, but the danger of any formula in communication is that by its nature, when something becomes formulaic in the communicative world, it becomes dull, it becomes flat, it becomes old. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later. It's not a moral position. Communication, no matter how good it is, doesn't separate between good and evil. And so for that same reason, it's not a vehicle for the truth. You cannot, simply because you're a good communicator, guarantee the truth. The fact is, truth and lies are both told with good communication. There's nothing that prevents somebody who's morally good, who only tells the truth, from communicating that idea well. But simultaneously, there's nothing that prevents somebody who's morally corrupt, or who's a renowned liar, from just telling that lie in a way that is interesting and compelling. And we'll talk a little bit about how that works in a moment. One of the other things that good communication is it's not a panacea. It's not going to fix everything. No matter how good we get at communication, unless we're vigilant, nothing is going to be permanently fixed by a really well written sentence or a very clever turn of phrase. No metaphor in and of itself has stopped a disease. But that doesn't mean that it's not actually partially responsible for the ability to do that. And we'll talk about that in a moment too. So what good communication is, well, it's more than language. To communicate well, you have to understand exactly what Reg had talked about at the very beginning, that transdisciplinary approach is the only approach. You can't communicate an idea well if you don't know the history of it. You can't communicate an idea well if you don't know the sociological ramifications of it. You can't communicate it well if you don't understand simply what languages work for what groups. And so we need ethno-linguistics and a whole sort of host of other approaches to communication in order to do it well. But again, I want to stress, even if we imagine this as being a tool for presenting important ideas, say how global warming might affect the Maldives, we can't actually guarantee that people will understand it if what we do is do it once and kind of walk away from it. It's far more complex than that. Good communication is an incomplete and necessarily inaccurate system of information transfer. Language doesn't work like we often imagine it does. It is symbolic in its representation. There is no direct connection between the letters TREE and the object tree. Instead, we have to collectively agree in the English-speaking world that tree is a collective noun for things like birches and elms and oaks and all kinds of other things. And that's always a symbolic representation, which means it's always fraught with the danger of being misunderstood. And so language is by its nature protean, shifting. It doesn't stick to one plan or another. We have to tame it, and then we have to constantly watch it to make sure that it's doing what we hope it's doing. It's not only or at least not fully rational. We don't just get stories in a rational way. Somewhere along the lines, I think everybody was taught in a college writing class or in an English class when they were in high school, the idea of sort of Aristotelian or Platonic knowledge, right? This idea that I'll make a thesis, I'll make an argument, and then I'll support that with 3 bits of evidence, and then nobody could possibly argue with me ever. But anybody who's ever had a sibling knows that it doesn't really matter how much evidence you present. You're not going to win everybody over simply by saying, these are my points. And even if they are rationally sound, they don't guarantee the convincing of a population. For a number of reasons, but not in the least of which is everybody always believes they're already rational. So what it is, in short, it's an inoculation. It's a vaccine. It won't cure anything. It's not a panacea. It won't make it all go away. But good communication, if used vigilantly and often, is a way to inoculate us against bad information. It should be and is tested frequently. We can't just communicate an idea. We have to figure out if the things that we know, that maybe all of you know as scientists, actually reach a population of people in such a way that they are convinced of. And at the end of the lecture, we'll show a little a clip that maybe highlights some of that. And we'll try to talk our way through some of that. So at best, it's a vaccine. At worst, bad communication. It allows us to believe everything that is kind of spat at us, as Dr. McCall just suggested. So, some things we need to know before we understand how language and communication work is that the humans as a sort of innate nature see the world as a set of stories. We also only accept those stories which we see as true because they match our values, our beliefs, and when they do match our values and our beliefs, we see them as common sense, and we don't get why the other side, whatever you might imagine the other side is, why they just don't see it. This is so obvious, are some of the things that we say when we are deeply convinced about how right we are and how wrong people who disagree with us are. How can you not see it? It's just common sense. But common sense is not common at all. It's actually manufactured. And the way in which we create common sense is complex and not actually the focus of today's conversation. But in short, the way we understand things as common sense is crafted by all the stories we've been told beforehand. After all, if you think about common sense, it's not a necessarily scientific thing. It is instead I know these things to be true because I've either A, experienced them, or B, been told what to expect if they happen, and I believe those things to be true. Don't get me wrong, there's plenty of place for rational thought, for those things that we can test scientifically, but we are, in fact, less likely to believe those scientific claims that go against however we might imagine it, what we see as both common sense or values. It's why there is a Flat Earth Society today. It's why there was the Scopes trial about evolution, because some people see things as common sense that I think most of us would struggle to see as rational. And so though we often claim that we are rational and that we're incorporating all these things in our understanding of the world, and this is true for me as much as for anyone else, in fact, we're not. Narrative rationality requires stories to be probable, coherent, and exhibit fidelity. But what that means, and I'll get into all that in a moment, but what that means is if we don't see it as meeting any of those needs, we aren't going to believe your story, even if your story is backed up with a wealth of scientific data, and those data are used to tell your story. It doesn't matter that that's the case. Instead, what will often convince a person is how well it follows our own common sense, our own coherency, our own fidelity, or at least our own ideas about that. So while we want to believe that we're rational, the truth is that that's a story that we tell ourselves. The fact that we can be rational provides us with the possibility that we're always that way. But in truth, you are often far more likely to believe a story than you are to believe facts. We'll talk a little bit about why that is. I'm going to use Walter Fisher as he's a narratologist and a linguist who studied how stories function in the world, and he created something he called the narrative paradigm. And basically, what he claims is that we are more convinced by a good story than by a good argument. He says that stories have, in their nature, the power to include beginnings, middles, and ends of an argument, and that the rational world paradigm, that's that which is filled with data and information, often fails to be as effective in sense making because it doesn't kind of complete the circle for us. It feels incomplete. Like when we first started getting information about COVID, so much of that information seemed contradictory or it seemed incomplete, even though it was the best science that we had on that particular issue at that time. And often we took it and we thought, well, that's all fine and well, but somebody over here is telling an equally compelling story about, I don't know, horse tranquilizers, not tranquilizers, dewormers. And so narrative paradigm says that we can convince more people by a good story than a good argument, which means that if you're going to be a scientist who wants people to believe what they think, if you've done the work and you've figured out something huge and grandiose or small but important, you actually have to be able to tell that story to someone in order for anything to come of it. And in order to tell the story well, there's way too much to actually cover just right now. But in order to tell that story well, you need to do at least these two things. You have to be coherent and you have to be truthful in a particular way. So coherence is the degree to which a story makes sense. And it has to make sense to itself in some ways as much as it does to the world beyond us. That is, as it sets up its premise, that premise must kind of come to a crisis, and that crisis must be resolved in some way. And if those things happen, we tend to go, oh, that's a good story. So if I'm a politician trying to convince people about the need for, say, universal health care, I can tell a story wherein there's a kid who gets sick and his parents can't afford the medicines that are necessary for his survival. He goes through a number of treatments. His parents go into debt, huge amounts of debt. The kid himself doesn't survive the illness, and now the parents are left with the debt and no child. And that story has a sort of beginning, middle, and end that is, if I told it better than I just did now, heart-wrenching and you know, potentially convincing. But again, I do want to stress, there is no moral code here. We could argue just the opposite of that or anywhere in between, nor am I suggesting that the one I gave is necessarily the moral truth to things. What I'm getting at is, if it's coherent, people will believe it. The next thing is there has to be some sense of fidelity with it. And this means the degree to which the story fits the listener's experiences. And that brings us back to what we were talking about just a moment ago, which is what feels like common sense. If the stories that we've been told before fit with this story, then we go, okay, that makes sense. And if we know those things to be true, the things that we've been told before in this story fits along the lines of, it's got a similar structure, it's got a similar outcome, and regardless of all that, it matches my experiences or my sense of right and wrong, then it has some fidelity to the truth as I understand it. And so Fisher in the 1980s makes the case that the narrative paradigm is in many ways more important a tool for communication than the rational paradigm, that putting together a really thoughtful paper is all fine and well, but it doesn't convince people in the same way that a narrative does. We see some examples of that when we see famous scientists kind of shifting their focus from purely doing the research and understanding the world to becoming some sort of public figure like Neil deGrasse Tyson or Carl Sagan, who, in the case of Sagan, wrote novels often to convince people of the things he knew to be scientifically true, and hosted programs on television in order to convince people of things that he knew to be true. But I want to be clear in our earlier claims that there is no single answer and there is no panacea. There are people who disagree with what Fisher has kind of laid out. Among them, though not only him, Nassim Taleb, in his book Black Swan, makes the point that prediction, not narration, is the real test of our understanding of the world. He suggests, and I should point out that he's a math scholar and a stock market guru and an investor. But what he suggests is that the real problem of narration is that because it has to fit that formula of beginning, middle, and end, and tell us something. Excuse me for because it has to fit that, it will by its nature overlook, elide, remove key elements of the world from what ends up being the truth. And so we tell a story over and over again, and Jess will get into this in a moment. But we tell a story over and over again, and that story isn't necessarily the same thing as the facts, and as a result, we lose something. And so that should bring us to what I would say is a pretty important question. Which path do we follow if we're trying to communicate? Do we stick with the world of facts, statistics, and logic, or the rational model? Or do we go to the world of narration and storytelling? A question which is not easy to answer. So I'm going to actually pass it off to Jess now, and she's going to answer it.
I get the easy part. So we can go to the next slide there. So thinking about, of course, the answer is going to be something in the middle, right? That the whole point of today's talk, as many of our talks have been, is the answer is nuance. How do I move between possibilities? How do I move between answers? How do I move between information, whether that is rational or narrative, in order to achieve an end? And one of those ways is multiple literacies. Next slide. So probably some people have heard this term. I just went and grabbed an easy online definition for anyone that hadn't. But when we talk about multiple literacies, it is a way to identify that what we read differently depending on form, not just genre. So the way we interact with social media, the way we interact with scientific communication, the way we interact with the media, though that's not just newspaper articles, that's also blog posts, that's also opinion pieces. And part of why multiple literacies is so important is ultimately the better you understand how communication works, the better you can understand how you communicate with yourself, right? So how do I become aware of where I'm telling myself a story? How do I become aware of what story I'm telling myself? How do I become aware of where I shift that story in order to preserve what I wanted to believe without realizing I have? None of this, again, we're going to keep hammering the point that none of this is a guarantee or an easy fix, but whoops. There we go. That's all right. But that you have, when I engage with scientific communication, I have to anticipate that it's not going to always sound fun. And if I feel offended by that, if I feel like someone's talking down to me, that might be an aspect of that type of communication. And so I stop listening because I don't understand what to expect. Same thing with social media. Like one of the things we tend to do with social media is if one post gets a lot of interaction, we report on that post as if it represents a large majority, right? But ultimately, that's still one person. That's one person's opinion that now, at least on something like Twitter, we're all arguing about, sometimes violently, as if there's a mass of people out there. And so by understanding how the way we read shifts in these moments, we then have a possibility to better pay attention, not only to our reactions, but also what kinds of conclusions we're coming to. Okay, now next slide. So one of the literacies that we tend to forget about is what's called historical perspective, right? And I have some examples here of what I might call the everything is always new phenomenon. So to start, the top right, the One Health Commission description. So even One Health is pulling from ideas that predate it by decades, if not centuries. The one example I pulled out, it's a Russian linguist and philosopher named Bakhtin, and his concept called dialogism, which I'm very much oversimplifying, but basically everything is a part of everything else. So of course, the way that we do STEM affects the way that we do agriculture, affects the way that we do stories, affects the way that we do religion. All of these things are interacting with each other in ways that we may or may not notice. And there comes a point where you lose the ability to be effective in the world if you fail to understand the different ways things are moving, the ways that we are connected in a web as opposed to a straight line. The right under the Bakhtin quote, there's more to AI bias than biased data. We oftentimes, when STEM proves something, and please hear that with some air quotes, but when STEM proves something, we don't ever connect it back to areas in, say, the humanities or the liberal arts that has already made the claim or predicted such a thing was true. So that, again, for decades, people had been looking at how various values were embedded in linguistic systems. And once we got to AI language models and they started to reproduce those values, now it's new. Now it's proven. Now it is science, right? And the effect of that is it continuously creates the illusion that the humanities aren't doing anything and that what we are doing doesn't have any connection to the real world. Of course, we've all heard that commentary about the real world, right? And even in the humanities. So the lower right-hand corner, those are blurbs. The one that says Mayer's book is about a book called The Amazons. It was published in 2014. And this is one of the praise blurbs they put on the covers. And they talk about how Mayer's evidence is new. But it's not new. She wrote a fine book. She cobbled together a significant amount of various evidence from various fields. I'm in no way taking away from that achievement. But in 1994, Davis Kimball excavated the Kurgans in Eastern Russia and started to find these tombs of women warriors. And of course, there's been more work since then, but Mayer's not the first one to discover that. She's not the first one to put it together. And an issue with that is, especially when we get into things like sociology, gender, some of these more culturally related types of knowledges that are more complicated because they're more narrative based, then it's always new. So it's easy to say, I always need more evidence. Like, okay, that's an idea, but I'm going to need more evidence. Well, let's wait and see. Let's see if you can prove it again. But every time we prove it, we're starting over again, and that obscures the pattern. Okay, next. So here are some examples of that pattern. Of course, anti-mask league formed in city. That's from the 1918 Spanish flu. And if you go back and look up people's reactions in 1918, they are word for word at times the same things we said for COVID. And that doesn't mean that our reactions to COVID were right or wrong. But it means that what we were doing wasn't new, which means probably it didn't need to be as scary as it was, at least where masking was concerned. That we've gone through it before, that we came out the other side, that it wasn't the destruction of personal liberty, right? If we have the historical perspective, it helps alleviate some of that more extreme rhetoric that surrounds the reporting. Same thing with video games and the satanic panic. So, in the 80s, we were worried. I mean, they were worried that the kids playing Dungeons and Dragons, which included me, were also going out in the woods and forming a cult. And now that's back again. And we might change the details out. Maybe it's video games, maybe it's TikTok, maybe it's Dungeons and Dragons, maybe it's whatever book is most popular about wizards. But the reaction is the same. The 50s, the Red Scare with communism, that's back on ironically. We are once again worried about teachers teaching communism in school, brainwashing children, limiting free thought. That doesn't mean these issues aren't serious or that we shouldn't talk about them or that we shouldn't be vigilant about them, but that we need to understand when things are reappearing, that is a different situation that requires a different type of reading than when something arises out of nowhere for the first time in actuality. So if we can't understand how the thing is put together, i.e. where it fits in context, we can't communicate about it. All we end up doing is reacting to it as opposed to having any sort of productive conversation about it. Next. So here's some examples. Science communication failing during COVID-19. We see there a list of issues with various COVID reporting. And the reason I included these were so that we could see how scientists were talking about specifically the failure of science communication, which includes this blog where from I think 2008, he says, is when he started running it. And in 2020 was looking at what was causing people not to believe scientists, what was causing people to accuse scientists of misinformation. One of which, next, the hideous deficit, right? The idea that when somebody disagrees with us or somebody doesn't understand us, it's just because they don't know better. First of all, no one is ever going to react well to being told that they just don't know better. And one thing I would love to get across today, even though we've said it many times before, it's not new, but that there's not, when we say it's not a panacea, we mean there's not one thing you can do that will create a predictable reaction every time, right? This isn't quantitative in that way. But there are some best guesses, one of which is it's not that people don't know better. It's that they don't believe you. And those are not the same thing. And if you treat them as the same thing, we just end up in a repeated loop. Next. We also have this notion of false balance. So in my classes, instead of saying both sides, I've shifted to trying to encourage people to saying all sides or all facets, because it creates the illusion of duality. Not only the possibility of mistaking 1% opinion as being equitable to a 99% opinion or 3% and 97%, but also you then imagine that all of those 3% agree, all of those 97% agree. And of course, all of us exist on a spectrum when it comes to our opinions. And we might agree in general, but by eliminating that nuance, it becomes much easier to make the argument that you're not showing both sides, right? That you aren't presenting the information properly. And that's because of the logical fallacy. Next. So we want to be able to think about the ways in which some of this is manufactured, right? So the other reason you want to practice both multiple literacies and you want to practice your own communication skills is this isn't going to go away. And it's not going to be a thing we can avoid even if we get off social media, especially with the evolution of language AI and the way that more and more of life is online. And so companies are going to keep presenting narratives. They're going to keep creating memes. They're going to keep doing things that are designed to stop the debate process, stop the thinking process, and present a story that makes an immediate impression, reinforces whatever it is people desire to reinforce in a given moment, and lock us into false debates, lock us into spaces that keep us from asking the right questions and keep us arguing about the wrong ones. So that's communication in a nutshell. Now, what to do with all of this theory? We thought we would use our One Health minor video as an example. And then if everyone thinks it fails, that's a good conversation to have. So for our One Health minor, we needed to speak to prospective students, so people who weren't a part of delval. We also wanted to speak to current students who might be interested in this minor. We need to show what delval is and our history, and also make clear that that's not all that we are, right? That we are multifaceted, that we are complex. And the goal there is not to create just an immediate one identity, but to show, hopefully, that if you come and study these things, say for a whole minor, you will have a better idea about what the skills are and how to use them. So now let's watch that and see what we think.
I'm just going to presume that somebody here will tell us if it fails to play on your end. Here we go.
It is playing on my end.
Tell me a story.
Once, there was a woman who could read the sky, and a man who saw the fire in the rain. There were people who could taste the poison in the smoke, and those who predicted the rivers would run dry.
What did they do?
They screamed and screamed, but they weren't always heard.
So what do we do?
We have to tell their stories.
Their stories start here. And here. And here. We will tell our stories while we learn from theirs. We are one voice,
One story.
One world,
One
health.
Okay. So of course the answer is we need both, right? We need to be able to deal with the logic. We need to be able to deal with the facts. We need to be able to deal with evidence, but also evidence that evolves, evidence that we change with new science, with new experiments, with new discoveries. And then we need to be able to think through those things in a manner that makes sense to us. One aspect we haven't necessarily touched on yet today is specifically that all of this is plural. All of this is not tied to the individual, which is part of what makes it so difficult. The communication is, the language is not only yours, it's also everybody else's, which is why we have to begin to understand the necessity of humanities classes and humanities programs so that we aren't at the whims of the people who will continue to use communication to shape conversation.
So probably at this point, then I'm going to stop sharing, and we'll try to field some questions if you have them. I don't remember how much of this was mentioned at the beginning. I'm sure some of it was, but I'm the chair of the English department, and Dr. McCall is the coordinator of interdisciplinary studies. And that means between us, if you have an interest in minoring in One Health communication, you can come seek us out. Not to make this into a sales pitch, because we do mean it to be actually a conversation, but it is important. It was important enough that the National Endowment of the Humanities thought we should have a little money to start putting this stuff together and to begin having these conversations. So I'll stop now, but if you have questions for us, shoot, and we'll try to answer them.
Yes, please put them into the Q&A, and as those come.
You disappeared, Reg.
Yeah, I was thinking, I think my internet connection is a little bit unstable at the moment, so I stopped and waited. Yes, if you have any questions, please put those into the Q&A. I have a whole number of questions or comments. And I've got to say, for my own part, my growth into sciences really was fostered through stories. And it was even from those masters of the sciences, but telling the same facts, but within a storyline that pulled together a number of concepts. And I think one of the important things that, I hope all faculty members want is that our students aren't just walking away from each course and going, okay, I'm done with that course. Now I go on to something else. All of this should be building on each other and pulling together a number of different ways of looking at things and then putting that into a different narrative. Brian, something that you said early on kind of struck me. You were talking about people's own experiences and messaging, whether it meant anything to them or not. And I have a little story of my own. So I was working in rural Liberia, and I did quite a bit of work with having a colleague who was doing educational programs in villages all around the sole national park that existed in the country at the time. And so I was talking to a local farmer, and I don't know this for a fact, but my guess is, given the state of education in that part of the country at the time, my guess is that he was illiterate. But I was talking to him, and I asked him what was it that he was most worried about, and the man said, desertification. And I was so astonished by that. And so I thought, well, maybe he heard that word from one of the educators that I had working in the area. And so I said, what do you mean by that? And he goes, well, I see every year that the rains come later. And they're not as strong as they've been in the past. And they end sooner. And I am worried that with the forests being cut down, that we're not getting water up into the sky to create the rains that are necessary for me to grow the rice that I feed my family. And I'm like nearly in tears listening to this man and going, clearly, that comes from his experiences. And yet I could think, I could come back to America and ask anyone, so what do you think about desertification? And I would get a blank stare. Looks like we have a question, but if you want to react to my my silly little story, you can do that too.
Yeah, I do. I actually do want to kind of jump in there because I think that one of the things that we do have to talk about is that communication in that regard is often more powerful than we think. I mean, and this is not, again, to do away with the idea of rational thought and the reasons that, you know, the farmer had for thinking these things were very rational to him. It was your experience coming from outside and our idea of what education looks like that kind of influenced that. And you can see that all the time. I think like a humorous version of that is that all throughout their lives, James Doohan, the guy who played Scotty on Star Trek, and Leonard Nimoy, the guy who played Spock on Star Trek, they used to have, excuse me, they used to have PhD candidates in engineering and in science send them their dissertations and say, hey, can you tell me what you think about this? I just wanted your opinion. And their thought was, well, I'm an actor. And Leonard Nimoy used to say all the time, I would just be like, looks good, and send it back. But the way in which we perceive our world is such that even though certainly everybody who was there understood that these people didn't go to space, they were not actual scientists, it was so a part of their vision of the world that they saw the world in that way. And it meant things like, and this is something we didn't have enough time to talk about, but it meant things like it built up the ethos of these characters so that Leonard Nimoy became somebody who, when he spoke about science, people listened, even though there was no good reason to do that. And so power and authority often have something to do with that. But we can answer some of the questions that are in the chat if you have them.
So from Phoebe, we have a question. Do your ag majors take courses in the humanities, including foreign languages?
They do not, because we do not have a foreign languages department. And anyone, of course, that's been paying attention to West Virginia University knows that foreign languages is a discipline that a lot of universities are looking at cutting. And I would say that's a mistake for a number of reasons, but also just because as any field globalizes, then we need to be able to communicate with each other. And that means being able to speak various languages.
They do take humanities courses, though. Everybody's required to take humanities courses. And they have to take courses on under the new core, everything from global studies to cultural studies and that sort of work. But they do not take foreign languages. The only thing I would also add to that is that there is this growing trend in higher education to have foreign language courses kind of taught in a practical manner, if I can use that word, which is to say, like, oh, you need to know these words if you're going to be in ag, you need to know these words, you're going to be in a different area. That's a real dangerous way to teach a language. It's dangerous because it reduces the complexity of language and it makes it feel like language is solid. This thing represents that thing. So often, for example, in ag-related fields, people are taught agricultural Spanish. But the problem with that is Spanish comes from hundreds of different cultures and regions and areas, and trying to plug one word in when you're talking to someone from Chile as opposed to Puerto Rico or some other place is a really, it's fraught. It's not dangerous in the sense that, like, you know, you're going to be hurt or anything like that, but it's fraught with misunderstanding and miscommunication and really kind of missing the point. So for my own sake, I would say we have to save those departments because they generally try to teach language for the sake of how language functions and works, not for the sake of how it can be practical to know a little Chinese if you're going to go into business. That's fine. You should know those things, but that's not the same thing as knowing a language.
We have another question from Kayla. How can a narrator tell a story that is close to the audience or listeners' experience if they don't know what audience they are talking to?
There's your best guess.
I think there's something like, for one thing, you do know the audience you're speaking to, insofar as if you're a good communicator, you are creating your audience while you're creating your story. So, for example, in terms of, say, forgetting science for a moment, but just in terms of, say, literature, if I'm going to write a really complex and thick poem that is filled with references to other poems and the like, I know that the audience for that poem is not everybody. It's a very select group of people, right? Now, in terms of science, if I fill what I'm about to write with a huge amount of scientific jargon, then I've selected my audience there. The audience I've selected are scientists, people who understand it, or at least science enthusiasts who understand that. That might, on occasion, include Reg's friend in Liberia, right? Where desertification is maybe not a word that's popular for all of us here, but it does work for them. This brings us back to that multiple literacies approach. You can't just tell one story if you're going to kind of convey an idea, because you can't know which audience you're going to talk to. You must always select your audience, and you have to keep selecting different and broader audiences. And you can rely on some experiences that you expect everybody who might pick up the book knows or understands. But the other thing you can do is address the possibility that people do not share the same experiences as you do, as actually Reg did when he was telling his story to make it make sense. These are not the same experiences. I was expecting from my university education this, and he had these experiences because of his actual lived life experiences. But when you set that up to tell the story, you get somewhere.
And our next question is from Sarah. How do we balance between anecdotal fallacy and using stories to get scientific points across?
The one thing you do is you just tell people, right? Here is an example of a larger point. And of course, when you want to use anecdote, you need to make sure on your end that you understand what it represents and how well it represents it, as opposed to simply, here's an example and now I use it. Some of what we're talking about comes through depending on how well the speaker understands what they're trying to communicate. So you can't ever necessarily control how people will receive the story, and they might very well pull a meaning from the anecdote that you didn't intend, but you can frame it. And by framing the anecdote that way, it keeps in everyone's mind, in the forefront of their mind, that this is not, this is a way to understand this concept that also is more complicated.
And that is what Talib would suggest is the real danger of narrative. It does reduce things to anecdote, when sometimes what we need is data, which is why, though maybe it didn't always come through, it's certainly what Jess and I were trying to suggest is why we need both of these approaches to be actually fully successful. And why, Jess, I think rightfully pointed out, like, if you talk about climate science and you go, well, here's a denier and here's somebody who believes it, and you put them against one another like it's an even debate, well, that's an anecdotal version of what actually happens, when in truth, there should be 97 people piled up over here and 3 people piled up here, and then they should just start screaming and see who wins out. And so it gets complicated in that way, too.
Phoebe asks, I thought multiple literacies meant something else, i.e. the perspective the speaker is coming from, not the way in which the speaker crafts his or her narrative argument.
So I might be misunderstanding, and I'll just ask you to clarify in case I am. There is a thing called code switching, where we look at, from the perspective of the speaker, what is the best way for me to communicate out. But that is separate from reading different modes of communication in various ways. So clarify for me if that wasn't what you were asking about.
In the meantime, I'll keep on moving here with our questions, and if Phoebe comes back, we'll get to that. So Elisa said, you mentioned that not getting through to someone is not the same as the person believing you. Ultimately, what can we do about people who will not believe you, regardless of how many facts you provide and how well you communicate to them? Those that refuse to believe you, and science specifically, and are closed-minded, won't allow their minds to be changed. How could that be approached?
That's a really good and very complicated question and answer. There's a lot of thinkers who have kind of spelled out what we can do about this, and I think I'll use conspiracy theorists as a for instance. Lots of people will get engaged in a conspiracy because, I mean, maybe the simplest answer is because they're super fun. And it's kind of fun to believe in conspiracies, but also sometimes they match up with our experiences. And for example, we can go back through history and find moments when actual conspiracies did happen. So the idea that a conspiracy theory is wrong by its nature isn't true either. And I mention all this just to say, if somebody's deeply embedded in a conspiracy theory and you come up and say, well, here's science to prove you wrong, and they go, no, you're wrong, they're probably engaged in a type of thinking which is, you have to prove me wrong rather than the other way around, right? And that's bad reasoning without a doubt, but that doesn't mean we're going to be able to convince them with good reasoning. So unfortunately, I think the only way to convince somebody who's closed off to the idea of this is what we had talked about earlier, which is vigilance. A consistent and persistent repetition of what we know to be scientifically true, at least in the moment, and various different ways of spelling out how we know these things to be true, through anecdote, through statistics, through analysis. If we simply just try to say your system is wrong, it doesn't make any sense, they will definitely find ways to prove themselves right. One of the great misconceptions about people who deny science or who engage in conspiracy theories is that somehow they're stupider than the rest of us. That's actually not true. In fact, some of the greatest conspiracy theorists are highly, highly intelligent people. In fact, their high intelligence allows them to make connections to prove their points in very clear ways. Humans are by nature pattern-seeking animals. We look for patterns, and sometimes those patterns are there, and we call that science. And sometimes those patterns are not there, and that's pseudoscience or conspiracy theory. But intelligent people will link those patterns regardless, and they're very, very hard to convince that you're wrong about it. Usually, and I mean, this is not a great answer, but I would say usually on some levels, the only real solution is time and winning over all the people nearby.
Phoebe has added to her explanation here. She says an example is a male describing short corn in his lunch as corn abortions when some of the table have experienced miscarriage.
Okay, so yeah, I would describe that as a difference in discourse, or code switching is the more common. That's one of those where different fields have different names for the same phenomenon. So there's the concept of how we use language, how we understand words to mean, and that's the self and the different perspectives you were talking about. And then there's the act of reading what is being presented to you. And that's where we get into multiple literacies, though of course in a conversation, you're still interacting with various discourses. So part of the corn example, the literacy part would be an awareness of other people's possible experiences and how your language is going to be heard by them. And that, if you think of it as a Venn diagram, that's going to overlap with your code, i.e., how do I speak appropriately to this audience in this moment?
Thank you. And then our last question. We're a little bit over time, and I want to respect everybody's time here. From Adrian, often we have to communicate in a very limited amount of time. For example, during a medical appointment. Any thoughts on the minimal amount of time necessary for a narrative approach to communication? Can we use this in medical visits as providers and patients to be better communicators?
So the short answer is yes, but that's not a satisfying answer. So let me maybe kind of frame it in a different way. Famously, Ernest Hemingway promoted these stories that he called 6-word stories, right? They had a beginning, middle, and an end. They had a message. His example is like, it's a sad example, so I apologize. But it was baby shoes for sale, never used. And it tells a whole story in 6 words. And it conveys that message that kind of sticks with us a moment later. What we've often framed in the medical world as good or bad bedside manner often has to do with how well we can communicate in this story or narrative format the things that are going on. But that too is fraught because we don't want to reduce the language of our expertise for a number of reasons. But if you're in a position where you're having to give a medical response to somebody, you don't want to just be like, well, the squishy parts have gone bad, because then nobody's going to believe you as a doctor, as an expert in your field. But simultaneously, if you get caught all in the jargon, it's gonna evaporate for them. And there is a sweet medium. It takes a lot of practice, and I feel like I just have to keep saying this. It doesn't matter how good you are at narrative, you will miss people. And no matter how good your narrative is, it will miss science. In the same way, no matter how good your science is, it will miss communication. And so we have to kind of keep those things in mind.
I would just add to that very fast. I know we're over time, but another aspect to consider are what narratives not to use specifically in the field of medicine, right? So what presumptions, what stories, what stereotypes are going to cause a patient to immediately distrust you or feel like you've jumped to conclusions before the evidence. So another way to approach it would be, how do I avoid those traps? And then the other stuff I'm trying to communicate will be heard more clearly.
I said that was the last question, but Phoebe has just kind of added on this. She kind of missed your explanation of codes. Jess, could you kind of go over that a little bit again?
I think that came through before I answered.
Okay.
I did type an answer to your question. I don't know if that helps, but I knew we were over time, so I went ahead and just typed an answer.
Well, this has been fascinating to me. I think that the video for the One Health communications minor is extremely powerful. And I encourage everyone out there who's in a major at delval to seriously consider adding on a minor in One Health communications. It benefits us all when we can do a better job of communicating our points of view, or those points of view that we're trying to get some kind of consensus around. For me, I was going to ask this question. I'm not asking it now, but I am struck by the problems that we have in explaining how serious climate change is. IPCC, the international group, puts out reports, and they started doing something that I found very interesting. They started adding graphics, like just small graphics, to try to emphasize what the potential impacts or what the impacts are from this. And I really see that is their attempt at telling a story.
I know you're not asking that question, but just a real quick answer to that, because I can't help myself, is that we don't respond to large scale well. If you say today 400,000 people died in an earthquake, we all feel bad about it, but we only actually have sympathy and empathy once, not all of us, some of us are better people than me, but once we start to hear the individual stories that are going on. Your farmer in Liberia is a better approach to climate change than using words like climate change instead of global warming. Those little shifts don't help.
Yeah.
Communication on a personal level, on a narrative level, can help.
Well, thank you both. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening. I've thoroughly enjoyed this. I hope that you will join us for the rest of our One Health series this fall. For those on campus, start thinking about One Health Week. That first week of November is coming up. We're going to have a whole slew of activities for you, and looking forward to that. Thank you, and have a great evening to everybody.
Thank you so much. Thanks for the questions.
Thank you.